Well, my friends, here we are in the middle of our lockdown, heading for our second weekend. And I'm glad to be able to announce that this is the beginning in Fountain Vineyard of a new preaching series. We, as a preaching team, will be opening up a fresh look with many applications in the book of Galatians. And so we're very excited to introduce Karen Marie, who'll be bringing the first message in the theme of Galatians and helping us understand that. But just to give some context, right now we find ourselves in this lockdown season, and I'm very conscious of the challenges, but also the benefits that we are engaging with. For many, this lockdown thing can be very disturbing, very fear-inducing. On the other hand, there are others that are already speaking of the way that it has created an opportunity to reassess life and how we do relationship. And what they feared has actually not come upon them. And many people are discovering that perhaps this is a gateway to new levels of how we do life together, how we relate, and how we should make space in our lives for the idiosyncrasies of others as they make space for our own crazies. So may God help us to do this well. But let's go to Galatians, and just to say a few things by way of introduction to this series that we'll be starting to listen to from this week. And this will be, I think, a 2 to 3 month series. We want to not just have information, but we want to be working transformatively with the insights of Galatians. And I'm struck by a few statements in Galatians that have really hooked into my soul. And chapter 1, I'm struck by Paul's opening statements where he speaks of his concern, his astonishment. He says in verse 6 of Galatians 1, that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ. How easily we can find ourselves led astray from the grace of Christ. The core of the gospel is the grace that calls us, and those that proclaim grace actually are the ones that hold us to an eternal hope. And Paul is concerned about those that are easily drifting away from that. And this comes whenever we lose sight of grace. We dare not lose our base in grace if we want to be faithful in the eternal purposes of God. And in the same chapter, he goes on to say, if I was still trying to please men, I would not be a servant of Christ. That's verse 10. And we just heard Josh speaking about that, not living a second-hand life. I think last week Josh spoke about that. Not living a second-hand life, not being a copy of anyone else, but being authentically who God has called you to be. And that's very much what the gospel does for us, and Galatians will help us to see that better. And at the core of this gospel that Paul is expounding in Galatians, he says in chapter 4, verse 15, and he asks it as a question, what has happened to all your joy? The loss of joy is a first and most profound symptom of the loss of our base in grace. And the call to be a grace-based people will issue in the emotion of grace, which is joy. Living that joyful life, a life that is rooted in a conviction that God's love is the most secure truth that we could ever engage our lives to and be based on. And so when we lose our joy, it's probably because we lost sight of the grace of God. And the grace of God is a releasing truth for us, because what can separate us from His love? Nothing. Neither on this life or the life to come, heaven, earth, wherever, whatever, nothing can separate us from His love. That's the understanding of the grace of God. And then the Galatians book concludes the last 2 chapters on the power of community that such a grace gospel invites us to. And we find ourselves living in a new way with one another because of this. So I don't want to take any more time away from Karen, who will speak in a few moments about this. But I'm intrigued by the engagement of Zacchaeus, who has that encounter with Jesus, who says to him, come down, Zacchaeus, I want to come and eat with you. And in the exchange of that meal, something happens in the transaction that causes Zacchaeus to stand up and say, half my goods I'm giving away to the poor. And if I've cheated any man, I'll pay him back 4 times as much. And there's a story told of a Jericho newspaper writer, if there was such a thing, a reporter, who interviews Zacchaeus and says, what happened in that moment? What happened in that room, at that meal? And Zacchaeus said, it was a simple thing. I looked across the table at Jesus, and I looked into his eyes, and I saw there in Zacchaeus' eyes the Jesus I was meant, the Zacchaeus I was meant to be. And I just love that the Zacchaeus I was meant to be. As he looked into Jesus' eyes, grace helps us to see what we could become. And to maybe just to close my part, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the great Baptist preacher, said, as he explained in summary his conversion to Christ through the gospel, he said it worked like this. Christ looked at me, I looked at him, and we were one forever. May God bless you as you engage with us together in this journey of discovering God's truth and the power of his grace in the book of Galatians.